Files.
While there's still no word on a cure for the virus,
report suspicious activity in the call 911.
I can give you every assurance, Mr. Rudy, that Gareth is ill and he's
Howdy, folks, and welcome back to another episode of your favorite podcast, That Would Be Rad. We are a podcast that majors in 80s and 90s nostalgia, comic culture, all things paranormal, and minors in retro video games, tabletop RPGs, pre-internet mysteries, and raising our kids to be half as cool as we were back in the 80s.
Whoa. Hold on.
What?
Did you read the whole thing?
Yeah.
And minors in?
Mm-hmm.
God.
Thanks for interrupting me, man.
Sorry,
I'm
man.
glad that you weren't paying attention, but hey, this one's for you.
Man, it didn't seem that way.
We're your hosts, Woody Brown.
And Tyler Benz.
Now listen, man. Okay, I know that I just kind of like stupefy you with how professional I'm able to do that, but don't interrupt me again. Okay. Oh, look, dude, this is kind of like a couple weeks in a row, and I appreciate this. You know, I've kind of got it easy because this is another one of those days. This is another one of those episodes where you're like, hey, man. But this one, you were even more, I guess, mysterious about it. You know, I know you have a topic. I have no idea what it's even called or about or anything. So I'm pretty excited to just kind of dive in and get started.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very appreciative that you finally publicly say, or just acknowledge the amount of work that I do for the podcast, and the fact that I'm doing like every episode, just it's like my back is like so sore from just carrying this show. Mm-hmm. So it does make me happy to hear you say all that. No, all kidding aside, this story today that we're talking about is one of the most baffling and confusing, maybe, and mysterious sort of disappearances maybe that we've ever had. One interesting thing about this is when doing research, I realized that this was Unsolved Mysteries' very first episode.
What?
Yeah. And I didn't know that until a couple days ago.
Like the very first one ever.
The very first one ever. And it was actually before the legendary Robert Stack would take over as narrator.
And so we're not going to play that here because I don't care about the other
Yeah,
dude.
exactly. But I just thought that was really interesting that was probably sort of the genesis of what would kick off, a show that would last for, 15 years or so.
Something about Stack's voice. We've talked about this on the show before too.
Oh, dude.
It's just so creepy. Except for when he's like an FBI or CIA agent in the Beavis and Butthead movie.
Oh, right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So the case we're talking about today is the mysterious disappearance of Don Kemp. This story takes place back in 1982 when a man by the name of Don Kemp, who was a New York advertising man, he was 35 years old, I believe, super successful guy, great job, living sort of the high life, a man in his 30s. And he had an automobile accident several months prior, and because of that, I'm guessing that he had some time off, and so he packs everything up in his car, and he goes to take this long track leading from New York all the way to Jackson Hole, Wyoming. And the reason that he did that was he was a huge Abraham Lincoln fan. He was sort of fascinated with the death of Abraham Lincoln. He was in sort of a club, I guess, if you will, that would meet, and they would sort of, probably kind of
like talk about it. Like, hey, man, Lincoln's dead, huh?
Well,
Yep,
well no.
Dead.
I think it was like, they were sort of researchers like, oh, hey, I turned this up about this guy that could be connected. And
okay, so they're like trying to like look into conspiracies and stuff.
Yeah, it was mainly over his actual sort of assassination. He takes off to go on this trip in his Chevy Blazer, classic, big old gas guzzling American car. and heads to Jackson Hole, Wyoming. The whole reason he was headed to Wyoming was he, in this time off, he was going to write a book about Abraham Lincoln's assassination. The day before he would disappear, Don was actually seen at a museum in Cheyenne, Wyoming, the capital, and it was said that he sort of was seen wandering through, all these sort of galleries for several hours. He spoke to no one, and when he left, he apparently forgot his briefcase. In the briefcase were traveler's checks, several of his diaries, and notes, covering the Lincoln thing, and his driving glasses, which that's sort of an interesting sort of part of the story, because these were glasses that anytime he was driving, he had to wear these glasses.
Yeah.
The next day, on November 16th, at 10 a.m., Highway Patrolman Randy Teeters would come upon an eerie sight. They would find his car, his Chevy Blazer, abandoned in the middle of nowhere, out in the sort of this very barren part of Wyoming, 40 miles from any town, both ways. His car door was open. His car was still running. The lights were on. And you would see several of his belongings and clothing sort of all scattered out, like they were just sort of falling out of the door and around his car.
Weird.
Yeah, which is really weird. So like I said, the headlights were still on, the engine was still running, and Don was nowhere to be seen.
Man.
Immediately, the police would come on the scene and begin looking for him. Sheriff Ogburn, which was the sheriff on the case, immediately, I think this is sort of a very unfair kind of thing. So like I said before, he did have a car accident before, and I guess he had sort of sustained some injuries. It's kind of unclear what those were, but the sheriff said, like right out of the gate, he says, well, I think he was disturbed. He was clearly probably having some mental problems and or health problems, because no one would just walk out into the middle of nowhere.
Well, I think he was mentally disturbed. He was having mental problems and possibly some health problems.
And again, this is in November in Wyoming, so really cold, snow everywhere. And, obviously it was freezing. Like I said, the police would come. Deputy Rod Johnson would actually be in a plane and fly over the area for several hours, just looking to see if they could see anything. The reason that Sheriff Ogburn would say that he believed that he was disturbed was that you would see footsteps from a single person coming from the car, from the Chevy Blazer, and they would, lead out into the middle of nowhere and then completely stop.
Jeez.
Which is kind of an interesting thing, because the only other explanation would be, this person, let's assume that it was Don, walks out into the middle of nowhere and then retraces all of his steps and walks backward, back to his vehicle, and then magically disappears. So I don't know. That's just one of the many weird sort of pieces of this puzzle.
Yeah.
The cops were absolutely baffled. The next few days, they would bring in helicopters and, put out basically a search party. Several days later, they would find a barn that was actually 6 miles away. And in that barn, they would find a pile of sticks, like kindling, like somebody was getting ready to start a fire to keep warm. And then beside that, they would find one of his socks.
Socks that were found in the barn were Donnie's socks. I have no idea how they got there. I think they were put there by someone other than my son, to look like my son had walked out there. And I don't believe my son did.
Which is kind of interesting. Yeah. There were no tracks leading into the barn. And keep in mind, this is I mean, the car was still running, which would lead you to believe that, I mean, it couldn't have been more than a day, you know? Because eventually the battery would just run out.
The gas would run out.
Right. Especially in an 80s, you know, Chevy Blazer.
Mm-hmm.
Meanwhile, a friend of his who is an artist, we'll call her Judy, she lived in New York. She was a big artist on the scene back in the 80s. She would receive 2 telephone messages on her answering machine. She didn't get them for at least a month because she was out of town traveling. And, you know, back then for all you millennials and Gen Zers that are listening, we didn't it wasn't just like voicemail or anything. It was an actual machine that would store these messages. So when she got back home, she listened, and
I'm absolutely certain that it was his voice. And it was a very brief message. I'd like to speak to you again. Call me in a phone number. The next day, I called, asked to speak to Don. A man answered the phone. He said that Don was out. I'm convinced he holds the clue to what really happened to Don.
She would say that his voice was very strained, and he definitely sounded like stressed out. Part of the liaison in a lot of this was Don's mom and Don's sister, and they believed throughout this entire ordeal that there was some foul play involved. Even though the sheriff and the police force was pretty much like, oh, he must have had some sort of mental illness because nobody in their right mind would walk out.
Just like walk out into the wilderness or whatever.
I was certain he was in a horrible jam. I just felt it because this was so unlike my son. I knew that he hadn't walked out there. I feel that he didn't. And yet the sheriff kept saying that he was out there. My son was murdered. I definitely believe this. Absolutely. He was murdered.
We never did suspect foul play. He was out there and was avoiding us, stayed away from us. And I believe on the second or third day, he was going to try to get back to his vehicle. He seen he was in trouble, and he didn't make it.
It's like, okay, well, how do you explain those footprints magically stopping?
Yeah. Well, I mean, like, real quick, just to dive in, I understand their perspective a little bit, like their approach. Like, I mean, you're 40 miles from any town. It's cold. Mm-hmm. It's, you know, like, yeah, it's definitely unfair for them just to assume something, but at the same time, it's like, why would someone with there's not a whole lot of answers for why someone that is in the right mental space would just stop their car and then walk away.
Yeah, right.
You know,
and the way it was, you know, the door's still left open, the engine's still running. There's all this like clothing and just like
all of his things. Like, it kind of just did it look like someone had kind of messed with the clothes? Is that
so?
Stuff strung out of it. The door's open. Neither of us has seen anything like this.
It looks like maybe if somebody had a big bag and maybe they reached over and grabbed this big duffel bag that was open from the passenger seat, and they were rushing to get out. Like, all these sort of clothes were just sort of thrown around. I mean, I don't know. I mean, it could have been sort of like a ransacked type thing. I mean, you can definitely see that there's a decent amount of stuff. So his friend Judy would have these calls, and they were definitely from him. There were 2. And in both of them, he would ask her to call him back. And when the police were involved, they would track the phone calls, and they would find out that these calls were actually coming from a trailer in remotely similar sort of area of Wyoming. It never gives the name, so it's kind of hard to find out. But I think the reason why is he, in all of this, like I said, his mom and his sister refused to give up, even when the police had. And, you know, a lot of times I think they were probably overstepping their boundaries. And
who's that? The mom and
the sister? Yeah.
Okay.
Which, you know, did lead into probably harassment a little bit with this guy.
Okay. Hold on. Let me just circle back. Okay. So his friend, and she's located where?
She's still
Not
in New
Wyoming.
York City too.
Okay. So New York City. She goes, she hasn't been home in a day or two, goes home. She's got a couple messages on the machine. She presses the play button.
Yep.
And one of them is a potentially distressed sounding Don Kemp.
Yeah.
The police trace the origin of that call, and it leads to this remote trailer in Wyoming, somewhat close to where the car was found?
Sort of, yeah.
Okay.
It's not really clear, and I don't know if that's to sort of protect this guy.
Yeah, okay. From like harassment and stuff?
Yeah. The trailer was in Casper, Wyoming. But anyway, on these phone calls, Don would say, I'd like to speak to you. Please call me. And I guess the last message, Don would leave a phone number. And the Judy lady would say that the next day, I called the number and asked to speak to Don. The man would answer and say that Don was out. First, he would say, oh, Don's not here right now. And then that was it. And then the next time she would call, the man that was renting the trailer would say that
I tried in every way I knew how to contact this young man. I finally spoke with him only one time on the phone, and I asked him about my son. And he said he knew nothing about Don Kemp. He knew nothing about Don Kemp. He just paid those phone bills. He didn't look at them. And I told this young man he was lying. You know what has happened to my son. And he just hung up on me. God knows what happened to my son in that trail. It's too horrible to contemplate. I don't know.
And then, as this case would kind of go on, when the police were involved in all the interviews, he would say he had no knowledge of any phone calls. He had not made any phone calls.
He told us that he had no knowledge of the phone calls and that he had not made the phone calls. I had an occasion to show him a picture of Donald Kemp, and he said that he did not know Donald Kemp, had never seen Donald Kemp, and knew nothing of his whereabouts.
So, unsatisfied with all of this, the mom ends up conducting her own sort of investigation. She refused to just let it lie and refused to believe because of that one little clue where the very first call, I'm thinking maybe this dude was caught off guard or who knows. And he says, no, there's no Don here, or Don's not here right now.
Weird, man.
Yeah, it's really weird, and it just continues to get even weirder. They say the man was always very cooperative, throughout this entire thing. He would continue to just claim that he knew nothing about it, knew nothing about Don.
I have no reason to feel that the individual here in Casper had any knowledge of this man's even being in Wyoming other than these phone calls, and I don't have an explanation for it, nor did he.
Shortly after, he would end up with getting an attorney, and I'm guessing, I think a lot of people probably look at that and say, oh, well, that means he's probably guilty, but I think it's probably, I don't know that that's a smoking gun. I think if the mom and the sister were, calling nonstop and trying to get all this information, saying, what happened to my son, I mean, it's probably natural to lawyer up, Mm-hmm. But eventually he, like I said, would get a lawyer, and then eventually, shortly after that, he would move away.
Who made the phone calls? That's the big question. Who it was had to have been my son. Somebody can tell me exactly what happened to my son, because I know there are people who know what happened to my son. I know this.
One of the things that is interesting is that later on, Don's sister, years later, would say that it was so strange because the boy in the trailer and my brother looked like they could be doppelgangers of each other. They looked exactly the same. And if you were to look
at... It's weird that you say that, because my first thought, just as I'm listening to this and everything's kind of uncovering, is if it wasn't anything crazy. I've got a couple thoughts and theories here already.
Oh, just wait.
But that's just based on the info that I have now.
Right.
One of them is like, what if he's just trying to, and I guess it's because like, you've got and I forget her name, but the things that fascinate the heck out of me recently or like the Sherry, I think her name was like Papini or whatever, the lady that like faked her own abduction, ultimately just to find out that she just wanted the attention. I mean, dude, this lady's big time crazy, and her poor
I don't think I know about
husband.
this.
Oh my gosh, dude! It was like international news. This lady was allegedly kidnapped by these, Hispanic ladies on the side of the road and like taken. She was missing for like a long time. Then she would like call the husband. There's all this stuff. And then finally, like one day they find her on the side of the road. Her hair's been cut. She's got like a busted nose and like all these things. Guess what? Made it all up. I mean, crazy as hell. So anyway, I'm kind of looking at this through that lens, in that, like, he maybe changes his voice a little bit, calls his friend, whenever anybody calls in, he's just like, I don't know who that is.
Yeah.
Who's there?
Yeah, right.
And that kind of thing. I don't know. It's just very interesting. And the fact that they look alike. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, exactly. She would literally say that they looked identical. And if you looked at photos from this man in the trailer and Don Kemp, like in their high school pictures, she said you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. Like it was kind of uncanny, which is sort of a weird. So the thing about this whole case is there's a lot of things that are just completely unanswered. So it is a little unsatisfying in a way if you're one of those people who just like,
oh, my wife, dude, she hates unsolved mysteries.
Same. Yeah, exactly. And this one just has like all these weird things that they just kind of throw out that are like, oh, by the way, and then this. And it's like, what? What is that? And then it's just never answered. But all that to say, nobody really even like played into that as being like.
I mean, at this point, the cops think, what? Oh, he's just shacked up with this guy. It's 1982. It's the AIDS scare. I mean, like, what's going on?
No, so to me, like everything that I've gathered, and I could be wrong. Maybe I'm looking at this from another angle, but to me, it kind of seems like the cops just wanted it to be, an open and closed case. Like, he just walked out in the middle of nowhere and he died, and then, predation and predators, he was eaten, and the end. I really do feel that was kind of the thing. And I don't even know that they would have really continued the investigation if it weren't for the mom, the sister, and then his friend Judy sort of supplying all this other information. They were probably.
What's interesting. Sorry, go ahead.
No. I was just going to say they were probably like, okay, people, we're trying to shut this case.
Which is interesting. I'm glad I let you finish that. Because what I was thinking is like, that tells you a couple things here. Either they're just lackadaisical, love that word.
Oh, yeah.
And don't really care. Like, I'm thinking like, why wouldn't a small town police force care? Well, it either happens all the time, which is equally interesting, or they quote unquote have bigger fish to fry. But you're talking about like, hey man, you ever been to Wyoming? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like the other like big fish to fry would be like, hey man, Geraldine's 4 horses are sick and we got to get the vet out there. Like this kind of stuff to me kind of seems like this would be, whoa, we got to figure this out because
that's what I thought.
This kind of stuff never happens.
Right, right. It's like, oh, it's a small town where nothing ever happens. Here's our big chance to like,
So like I feel like then it must happen all the time. Like there must be tons of people that disappear in that area quite often.
I mean, if you look into
something,
and I'm not driving away from the doc here, but if you look into like David Paulides, his missing 411 work, I mean, Wyoming is my favorite state as of last year because, we went out and saw the Grand Tetons, and it's just the most majestic, gorgeous place in the world. I mean, it's just absolutely stunning. And, we didn't really pick up that, but you also got to think of, it's a lot like the Midwest where in the winter, it's just so harsh, for people really, that everybody is so sort of isolated and,
they just wanted to get inside and have some hot coffee.
Maybe, yeah. Seriously.
Yeah, I don't know. It's interesting.
Also, several days after this would happen, a blizzard would come through and, kind of get rid of any of the other evidence as far as like the footprints and stuff. But I mean, I think they had already got what they needed. They saw where the footprints would end. And so during this time, during Don being missing, 2 people would come forward and they would claim that they had actually sighted him. One said that they believed that they had sighted him on New Year's Day. I don't know if there were, they put out like missing like photos and they, did all that in like the post offices and,
And just to remind folks, this happened originally in November. Now it's like New Year's Day.
Yeah, right.
So a couple months after he went missing.
Yeah, right, yeah. So they would come forward and claim that they had seen him, and like you see in a lot of these cases, sometimes you can't really hang your hat on that because, and also I think, once you find out, and again, like this didn't come out until years later where his sister said this publicly, but the fact that like this other guy from the trailer looked just like him, for all we know, these people that came forward could have actually just seen this dude, if they look so similar. So 4 years would go by, and then the body of Don Kemp would show up very close to where his car was found.
What?
After these messages, we'll be right back.
On June 14th, your favorite emotions are back on the big screen in Disney and Pixar's Inside Out 2.
It's time to greet your Team Riley! It's anger!
Let me at him!
Fear!
Safety checklist is complete!
Disgust! Ew, ew! Sadness is in the house!
Oh, no.
Hello, I'm anxiety. I'm one of Riley's new emotions.
Disney and Pixar's Inside Out 2.
There's a part 2? We're going!
Rated PG. Parental guidance suggested. Only in theaters June 14th. Get tickets now.
There's something out there waiting for us. And it ain't no man.
Hey, this is Bryce Johnson from the Bigfoot Collectors Club, and you're listening to Tyler and Woody on That Would Be Rad, because that is rad.
Pretty fascinating, isn't it?
Dude, this is crazy. I mean, it does sound like a familiar story to me for some reason, but
I think
as I say that, though, like, I don't know, man. Golly, man. 4 years later,
right?
Body found pretty close to so it's like, well, I don't know. I'd be interested to like.
Oh, just wait.
Was it because like the area is so dense with forest?
No. This happened in the middle of a prairie. There's nothing.
And how does the body not just get like picking apart?
Well, so here's what's fascinating. So they would find his body 4 years later.
Okay.
The cops, of course, would immediately, as we kind of know of what their sort of behavior is on the matter, they would immediately say, oh, well, he just died of exposure. However, his body was completely pristine, which, number one, proves that there's no possible way that body could have just been out there for 4 years.
Yeah, like maybe like another couple months and he's like frozen. I mean, I hate to, like this is where it gets a little grotesque in terms of speaking of someone's remains like that. But, if I know you've probably seen those images and stuff of people hiking up Everest and they'll kind of pass by. It's, someone that was dead and had been there on their expedition or whatever previously. And, they're frozen. But that's because in that area where they find this body, the temperature doesn't really, get high enough to kind of thaw the person out.
Well, no, that
so like I could see if that area of Montana stayed frozen for 4 years straight.
Well, no. So that's the thing. Like The winters are extremely harsh, but when we went out there last,
yeah, dude, they're hot.
It's hot. It's in the 80s, and
yeah, there's no way. That's what I'm saying. Like if it was just like a couple months and the body was like pristine and all this, okay, well, that makes some sense.
And also, it's like a prairie, so, and I'm sure it probably belonged to, rancher, cattle farmers, or, whatever.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's...
I don't know where you're going with, hey, this is somebody's land or not, but like there are areas that are, family members that I have that have large ranches out in Texas and stuff. You could you could spend an entire
right.
You're not going to visit every single corner of the land. So,
but also this, like I said, this is like prairies, and it would have happened on the property of the farmer that, the barn where they found the sock and all that stuff. It is weird because, and maybe they did, but this is another thing that I haven't been able to come up with is I wonder how much of the investigation was done with the person who owned that barn. It's like, why is this dude sock in here? So I don't know, but the body was
like a pretty boy. Take that sock right on off.
But the body was found. It was taken. The interesting thing is the sister. Shortly after the body was found, I'm guessing by the next several days, she is contacted by a professor that works at the Smithsonian Institute.
Oh boy!
Just wait, dude. He is a forensic anthropologist who is also a trainer at the FBI. He said, "Hey, I'm really interested in your case. I'd like to see his body." And so the sister agreed, and I don't know if it was shipped out or who knows, or if he came out. But the professor would basically take possession of the body. He would go on to carry out his own investigation. He would call the sister several days later and say, "I don't know how to explain this to you. There's several things about your brother's body that I can't really explain. The hyoid bone, which is the bone that connects the tongue to the back of the mouth, is completely missing out of Don. There's also a really strange, tiny, round hole on the top of his head, and the professor would say, I've done this for years and years, and I can't think of any man-made object that could possibly make a hole like this. It would go straight through his head." And so you have to think okay, maybe this hole has something to do with this bone being removed from the back of his mouth. But other than this tiny hole, which the original person that did the autopsy, or probably the local coroner, he didn't pick up on either of these two things. He just said, well, the body's pristine. There's no...
Yeah, so other than that hole, what you're saying is there's no... Because I looked up the hyoid bone. It's been many years. I won't say how many since I graduated from college, but I did take physiology and anatomy, and I don't remember it. Not a big surprise there. We won't say it's due to...
I'd never heard of it either.
Any kind of consumption of beverages that would limit brain activity. But I'm just saying that I've forgotten about it. And so to sort of describe it to those of you listening, imagine like you're looking at a skeleton and just under the jaw, almost like it would be like above the Adam's apple, so to speak.
Yeah, like in that hole.
There's a bone, that it's almost like the shape of like a wishbone kind of, and we'll post pictures of what that looks like. But what you're saying is there's no other... Like if someone said, hey, today we're dissecting a cadaver and we need to remove this bone, step one would just be like, okay, cool. Yeah, right underneath as the patient's kind of like laying on their back, or as the cadaver's laying on their back, you would like surgically remove it maybe from right there at the throat. So there's no like cut.
Zero.
Just the opening on the, what part of the skull?
So this is
top.
I'm guessing it was just sort of around like the crown of your skull. I mean, that was
anything else missing? Any other? No.
But I will say it is important to note that she, again, it's not real clear on if this professor flew out, the forensic anthropologist flew out, or if the body was shipped to him. But I guess the sister would meet up with him and look at the body and say, yes, this is the body of Don, because you could clearly see the injuries that he had sustained recently in that car crash. Man. You know, so it's not like it was just sort of somebody else, possibly.
Mm-hmm.
So here's where it gets even more weird. During all this time that this is happening, the sister, again, is contacted by a group of people who were actually camping out in the area when Don would disappear. And there was another professor in this group, actually, who said, I've contacted you because we were in the area when and where your brother disappeared. The reason we were out there is we were studying cases of cattle mutilation. So we believe from our research and what we've seen in these cattle mutilations that this is exactly the same thing that has happened to your brother. And he was taken, which does, you know, I mean, if you're open to that, I mean, it makes a lot of sense. You know, we haven't covered cattle mutilation on the show, but this is a thing that's been around since the 50s, and it's all pretty similar.
Technically been around since the 1800s.
Yeah. But the I guess where they started taking notice was sort of around the 50s.
I mean, for those of you listeners that have taken our advice and gotten a passport to Magonia, or even, I think they probably talk about it a little bit in where the footprints end and things like that. I mean, there are cases all up and down the U.S. where people reported, you know, their animals being mutilated in various different ways. There's some, you know, sort of, I guess, common or somewhat common patterns of what's left and that kind of thing.
Oh, yeah.
Very strange stuff. I mean, certain things of like skin being surgically perfectly removed, sometimes like certain organs, you know, it's one of those things that like that isn't really arguable in terms of like whether or not it's happening.
Oh, it's definitely
whether or not there's some sort of like supernatural element or extraterrestrial element to it is you know, I think where people kind of, where there's that divide or whatever. In any case, to me, at the very least, I'm just listening to this case and then the potential cattle mutilation. If it's none of those other things,
right,
then at the very least, to me, it sounds like we got a serial killer on our hands, man, and they're practicing with freaking farm animals.
I just think that's...
And they're moving to humans. Now, that's I'm not saying that's what it is.
Right.
I'm just saying you can't go... That's like the barrier of entry in terms of...
right.
Like, it's at least that,
you know? Yeah, because we're talking about, and listener discretion is advised a little bit here, but we're talking about organs completely removed, you know, completely almost like laser precise, surgical, you know, incisions.
Accuracy.
Yeah. Like it's kind of like what we're talking about with Don's head with this little hole.
And like weird also, just to add something real quick too, because like on the surface that might not, believe it or not, sound super weird to somebody listening. That just sounds like, oh, that's weird. Could have been an animal or something. But here's the thing. When the organs and things are like removed, there's no mess. So if anybody listening has ever hunted and stuff before and you field dress an animal, stuff kind of goes everywhere.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, there's ways to kind of do it neatly and all that, but still it's hard. Like it would be hard to not leave blood and stuff in different places. It was like with these specific cases that Tyler's referencing, it's kind of a situation where it's almost as if someone had like a freaking high-powered shop vac and like perfectly removed any of the extra blood.
Yeah.
And you know what I'm saying? It's like very clean and weird like that. You know,
we refer to that
so
as exsanguination, which means no blood is involved, but all the blood is missing.
Man,
one of the things that is interesting is in a lot of these cattle mutilations, aside from these, you know, I mean, almost all the cases have, you know, the genitalia is missing, the anus is missing, the, you know, completely exsanguinated, certain organs are missing, but a lot of times also the tongue is missing. So I just wonder if that's some sort of parallel to him missing this hyoid bone, you know?
Yeah.
Oh, and what I was talking about, I looked it up real fast, and One of the most famous stories was actually in 1967 in the San Luis Valley, where a horse by the name of Snippy was, kind of mutilated, I guess, if you will. But that was the one that sort of really, really, really put it on the map. I think Linda Moulton Howe was a big proponent of cattle mutilation and stuff. But anyway, this guy would contact her and say, hey, we're looking into this. And it is pretty cool that, you did have these groups that were like doing this in the early 80s, because a lot of this research wouldn't really become mainstream until at least the 90s. So the fact that you have a professor and this group of people that are like out there, like boots on the ground, studying these cattle mutilation cases, I just think that's kind of cool,
Yeah.
Because, there were no TV shows that dealt with any sort of alien abductions, nothing like that. I mean, we have like our movies like Communion and the made-for-TV movie Intruders and like stuff like that, but that would come a little later. So another interesting thing is the sister would also say that before her brother would disappear, he gave her a book, and it was a book about the universe, and he turned to a page and he said, just keep this book. I don't know why. I can't tell you the reason, but I think this book may come in handy with you. And this page, I want you to remember this page. And so she turns to the page, and I think she sort of remembered this like after her brother died. And so she opens the book, and the page is talking about the Pleiades, which is sort of a star system where a lot of these sort of extraterrestrial beings are, UFOs. A lot of the people, especially in like I would say like 60s through the 90s, I think Betty and Barney Hill talk about the Pleiades, because Betty would be able to draw a star map of where she believed that these UFOs were coming from. And I think it was like tied in with the Pleiades. But that's just one of those weird, interesting things. It's like, does that have something to, was he sort of, I don't know, was he kind of like linked in on this stuff and, sort of getting these kind of subtle messages? I don't know. It's just one of many interesting, weird kind of things. And also he also had this sort of knack for, he would always find like coins anywhere he would go, right? And the dates on the coins would always sort of line up with whatever he was going through. So I don't know, it just makes me believe that like he's at least sort of cognizant of maybe these sort of synchronistic things happening around him. He's paying attention,
Yeah.
Here's another fact that gets weird. And this is part of the reason that the sister would go on and believe that him missing was somehow her fault. So before he would disappear, they went to a museum in Maryland that had a ton of Abraham Lincoln sort of memorabilia and items that he had, before he died. And when they arrived, the receptionist at the museum looked right at Don and said, "Oh, are you the man who's writing the book about Abraham Lincoln?" He said, "Yes, I am." They had never been to this museum before. And she hands him a card, and on the card was a phone number and the name of a psychic who lived in the area. Sort of as a joke, later, Don would contact the psychic, and she said, "Hey, I would love for you to come around and we can do a seance. And if you're so interested in Abraham Lincoln, maybe we could look into it and do a seance." And so Don and his sister and her husband, they end up meeting with this lady. They sit around this table, and they started the seance. And the psychic is telling the sister, certain things that have happened in their childhood that she was kind of hitting on that were pretty accurate. So at this point, they're kind of convinced, like, okay, well, this lady is not totally a charlatan. Like, this is,
right.
She's kind of hitting on stuff that, and again, I've said it before, I'm 50-50 on this stuff. I think a lot of times it's just observation and quick thinking folks, But they seem to believe that, hey, this lady's really onto something. All of a sudden, they were, during this seance, they would look up and there would be in the hallway the door would open and there was a figure of a woman standing in the hallway. She appeared to be wearing like an old-fashioned sort of Victorian like bustle dress. Suddenly the psychic begins like sort of freaking out. She begins making choking sounds, and right in front of their eyes, all three of them sort of corroborated this. They see a red line that slowly starts to appear and go from one side of her neck to the other, almost like someone was like cutting her throat.
Man, this whole time I've been visualizing this, and immediately when you started talking about the choking and then this red line, immediately I was like, she's got a lightsaber. This is Darth Vader?
Yeah, right.
Okay,
right.
Sorry.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
It wasn't a bustle. It was actually Darth Vader. But yeah, they start seeing this. Everybody sort of begins like screaming and freaking out and sort of panicking. And they said that, sort of like clockwork, Don sort of takes command of the room, tells everybody to grab hands, and he sort of leads the room in prayer, and eventually everything just just calms down, disappears, goes back to normal. And so it's just this weird sort of event that, for some odd reason, I'm guessing, it sounds pretty traumatic, but, that Don's sister sort of has always felt, ever since that, like, somehow that event was partially her fault, and that, tied into this whole kind of thing. And so here's where it continues to get even weirder. After his body was found, Don's body was found, his mom wanted to get the car back, because I'm guessing it had just been impounded at the police, department or whatever. I'm guessing, it would have had to be for 4 years. And so I guess she...
just leave it there, man.
Yeah, just it's fine.
Yeah.
Just leave it. So she ends up talking to her friend, a guy that was friends with Don growing up, and he agrees to drive out and get the car and drive it back, because, that's like a keepsake of the mom. And I don't know if this is like part of it. I don't know if this has any bearing on anything, but I'm guessing maybe when he was like a missing person, that they weren't able to let go of any evidence. Maybe, I don't know. That's the only thing I can think of with her just leaving it there for 4 years.
Yeah.
Maybe suddenly now they're able to have it. So the friend goes out and retrieves the car. When he's driving back, he ends up, staying at a little motel overnight. When he wakes up in the morning, he sees that the car has been broken into, and nothing is missing except a ton of Don's research over the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Which is, okay, let's chalk that up to just happenstance. But it is weird, because there were other things in the car that were clearly of more value, but for some reason they only, grabbed some of his notes and evidence and, probably diaries and that kind of thing. The friend would finally get the car back to the mother's house, and they would wake up the next day to find that the car was broken into again, and more, if not almost all of his research was completely stolen. So two nights in a row this happened, where a car gets broken into, and all they take is bits of research, for a random book over the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, which is weird.
Very strange.
And so they decide that they're going to donate the rest of this stuff to a fellow researcher. Remember how I said originally that Don had like a group that would meet up, And so they donated a lot of it to a fellow researcher who, several days after this, he would die and his house would burn down, destroying everything, including anything that could have possibly been donated to him that was Don's. Yeah.
Man.
I think in the several months after this, I guess they discovered sort of more stuff, maybe in Don's apartment in New York or whatever, and they end up finding some audio tapes. I'm guessing probably the little mini tape recorders probably. But they ended up giving that over to another guy who he sort of ran like an Abe Lincoln little Civil War museum in Virginia. Well, he, after this, several days later, he ends up coming up dead. And those audio tapes are nowhere to be found.
What?
Yeah, so it's just this weird thing of like what's happening here?
So did he potentially uncover some strange,
I don't know,
conspiracy truth about Lincoln's death? I don't know, man. This is so weird.
It is so weird, yeah. But like I said, I prefaced earlier about how he kind of had this little knack for like finding, he would see these coins, you know, right? And so the night that, I forgot to add this in earlier, but the night that the friend would drive the car back, you know, the first night back to his mom's house, she would find 2 coins on the ground. One coin had the date of the year that Don was born, and the other coin had the year that Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. And that was just sort of this weird common thing. So,
man, I thought you were about to say, and then they found the coin of the date that he disappeared.
I mean, that would be pretty awesome. But no, it's weird because like this whole thing, you know, I feel like just when you sort of start putting a narrative together in your mind of like, okay, is this like some sort of weird like alien abduction? Is this some sort of kind of thing? Then it leads into this, which is a totally different kind of flavor, you know? So it's like, what's happening? Is this some sort of, you know, cosmic joke, you know, sort of, it's all played out, or like what's happening? I mean, I guess that's kind of where it ends. I mean,
it's like, is it a literally potentially in the history of this show, maybe the weirdest series of coincidences and events that happened and their connections there? Maybe. But dude, I got a couple crazy, this is like the fun theory part, okay?
Well, hey, but before we get into this, let's take a break.
Oh man, I don't know if you can hear like how my spirit was just shattered.
Well, I know this
cool,
is gonna...
Yeah, you're right, man. Let's you know, dial back the momentum and just hear from we'll be back after these words.
We'll return after these messages.
It's a pretty cool place if you're a Martian.
Or a vampire. You think you really know what's happening around here, don't you? We're fighters for truth, justice, and the American way.
Hey, this is Woody.
And this is Tyler. And you're listening to That Would Be Rad.
And now, back to our show.
Okay, so here's the part where we're kind of getting into what we think happened. So,
and do you want to hear what I've got?
Oh, that's what I'm talking about.
Hey man, hey, can I?
You are allowed
permission. What is the thing on the office when he's like, "Hey, Michael, can I have your permission to get the meeting started?" Mr. Cocktail. Okay. This is the fun part. All right, for me, like immediately, you know how hard it was to keep from just throwing this in there and just like almost out of the gate because of the type of car that he's driving.
Dude, I thought the same thing, dude.
It is a Chevy Blazer.
Thank you.
The same car that John Teeter allegedly uses as a time travel device. Now,
and
that's the first thing. Hold on, no, but it's my turn.
Okay, well, if you leave this out, then I'm jumping in.
Okay, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say,
I might leave it out.
I was going to say our guest.
Yeah.
Okay.
You mean our guest?
I mean our
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. John Teeter.
Our listener.
Hey guys, I come from the future.
No, but our listener would send us.
Yeah, right. One of our listener stories in this episode.
Hear this listener story on That Would Be Rad, Season 3, Episode 8, John Teeter sightings, aliens, and sleep paralysis.
Also had photos of what looked just like it could be John Teeter's Blazer. Now, there's a couple of things here. As I started thinking about, not that I wasn't paying attention the entire time this is unfolding, I was, but in the back of my head, I was kind of thinking, okay, like if there's a time travel element here. And again, folks, I know this is just again for fun because that would be rad if time travel existed. Okay. So if there is a time travel element, is it more of like, okay, what if John Teeter knew that this Don Kemp guy was a danger to the world, not because of the Lincoln book that he was going to write. Maybe there was something else that he was destined to do. And John Teeter came in, maybe he took him to a different time and then interrogated him or whatever, and then assassinated, dropped off the body 4 years later. But
I mean, or even at the most mundane sort of ideas is that, like, if nothing else, just the idea of John Teeter actually driving the Blazer that belonged to Don Kemp, even just that alone is pretty awesome.
Yeah.
You know?
And then I started thinking, like, was this guy that they called in this trailer, was that John Teeter? Maybe that's a base that he's got.
Yeah.
I don't know. Okay, so that's one theory that I got.
Yeah.
Another one is very sort of in this world of high strangeness, vanilla, if you will. And that is that, yeah, there's a psychopath serial killer on the loose who performs these strange surgical procedures that are above and beyond. Look, we already kind of heard the quote-unquote expertise of these 1982 Wyoming police force. Maybe their small-town, coroner wasn't able to see, like, the precision that, like, potentially, like, a high-level surgeon or something would. I don't know. I mean... like I said earlier in the show, like, if it's not time travel, alien abductions, blah, 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 then at the very least, there's a lot of strange things going on. That's even before you told us about the belongings get passed on, and then the house burns down, the guy dies. And then they send some more over. Like, this again, I'm going to repeat it because I feel like it's our responsibility to do so. If... listener, you find something strange in the woods that looks like some sort of artifact, please, for your safety and or your family's, don't take it into your house, okay?
Yeah, for sure.
That's rule number one. Rule number two, if I go missing, I'm going to tell, we're not donating anything to you to research it because, again, safety of you and or your family, because what if there's some kind of curse going on? Finally, number three, anything is possible.
That's true.
You know what I mean? And generally that means it's probably time travel.
Well, I think, like I said, it really does sort of, just when you feel like you're getting your footing and you can kind of explain it, it takes a hard turn. The only thing that and this is sort of a little bit of a mundane explanation too, but the only thing that I can think of is, and this doesn't explain any of the weird stuff leading up to this. I'm just referring to the sort of Lincoln connection. But one of the things that I think was fascinating is it was said that his whole book and the theme of all of his research was about Lincoln's assassination, right? And so I did a little research into that to see if, like, well, is there anything, weird with that?
Yeah.
Is there any other sort of foul play? And actually there was, and I'd never heard of this until now, but apparently Andrew Johnson, who was vice president to Lincoln, it was known, and it was sort of, I don't know if I would say commonly known, but I guess at the time it was like sort of a conspiracy theory, if you will, that he had arranged the assassination.
So that he would become, for non-American listeners, then the next in line would be the vice president, right? And so
yeah, right.
You're saying,
right.
Yeah.
Okay. But this was such a believed thing that it was actually, back then, a special committee was formed to investigate Johnson, which is really interesting. The other thing, and
especially since we're constantly inundated with all the different committees and all this kind of stuff, just with the last 4 to 10 years, it's interesting always to go back in U.S. history and hear that this kind of stuff has been going on.
Yeah, right.
Forever.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Yeah. Well, here's where it gets a little weird too. As you know, I have had men in my life, my grandpa, my uncle, that are some of the best men that I've ever met. right? We're talking integrity, deacons at our local church growing up, but they were Masons. And, you know, as I've sort of always been into conspiracies, you know, as you know, the Freemasons, you know, that's sort of part of it, you know, secret societies and Freemasons. It is interesting because Andrew Johnson was actually a master Mason in the Greenville Lodge number 119 in Greenville, Tennessee. Apparently there were all these little connective tissues that would lead you to kind of believe that, oh, there was some sort of connection between something with the Freemasons, something with Johnson. But it's even said that several hours before Lincoln was shot, John Wilkes Booth was actually seen by several people stopping by the Kirkwood house to meet with Johnson, but he wasn't at home. Another reason that we know this is because John Wilkes Booth would actually leave a personal note for Johnson. So it's like, why was that going on? You know, like
weird. Yeah.
But it has to do with, like, you know, the abolition of slavery, and you know, Johnson would later refuse to join the Confederacy, and he would join the Union. There's all this kind of like stuff that, you know, if you look at it through the lens of like the time, and like if it did have something to do with a Freemasonic, you know, boys club, secret society, a lot of those decisions that were being made by Lincoln, for all we know, could have been really stifling certain moves that the
Freemasons wanted.
Yeah, that the Freemasons kind of wanted to happen.
So basically, like the broad stroke version of that is the Freemasons potentially plotted to assassinate Lincoln, and then fast forward to 1982, they find out that this guy's going to be writing a book that uncovers something, and they take him out.
Yeah.
And then they do it in a way that's going to make it look so bizarre and crazy, and it's such a big organization with tentacles everywhere that they can kind of follow it and make the weird things happen, such as like burning down some dude's house. You know, they think there's information there.
Well, and I think that, you know, from some of the research and sort of into sort of the modern age of sort of conspiracy theories and like Freemasonry, I mean, man, there is a lot of stuff. And it, in my mind, I'm really sort of torn, because on the one hand, like I said, I know people that are Masons, and they're like the greatest people that I've ever known. You know, they're just good men. But then you hear this stuff, and I think there's sort of a delineation between your big, you know, super high level Freemasons. Like once you start talking about men that are, you know, called master Masons and like 33rd degree Masons, like these are the guys who are actually looking behind the curtain, I would say. Yeah. You know what I mean? So, whereas like your everyday small town, you know,
they're not getting that. They're not privy to like the ultimate
they're just
kind of thing.
They're not seeing any of that.
And I'll just point out too that like good people are good people, bad people are bad people.
Yeah.
Organizations have both.
Yeah, right.
You know?
Absolutely. So. But I think that if this is true, and this is just sort of where I end up with this, I think that this group of men that Don was meeting up with, these sort of Lincoln aficionados, if you will, I think the possibility that one of these men could have been a Freemason, and possibly he could have mentioned it to a higher up about this Lincoln thing, and you know, him writing a book. And you also think too, I mean, this guy was kind of a big deal. He was a big ad exec in New York City. So, you know, maybe he couldn't, but I think the general consensus would be, well, if nothing else, he puts out a book, it's at least going to get some traction because of his connections within the advertising industry, you know?
Yeah.
So I think that could maybe have some time. My thing is this, though. I think that I can't land on one thing. I think it could be a whole bunch of things.
Yeah. I just can't imagine somebody having, like some, yes, successful, but New York's a big place in 1982, you know, not very well known, never written a book before person making so much, like getting the waves so big that they would call attention to this in such a way that not only are they going to follow this guy all the way out to Wyoming, but they're also going to take him and they're going to kill him and then wait 4 years to just dump the body. Like, there's just so many like things that it's just like, it doesn't make sense.
Well, see, that's the part that I don't think any of that had to do with, or has to do with my sort of Freemason theory. I think that whatever happened to him with like the car and then the footsteps stopping and him disappearing and then just popping back up, you know, in the same area, his body's completely pristine, and then like the weird missing like hyoid bone, and then the surgical laser precision, you know, hole in the top of his head. Like, whenever I first read that, to me, it was this sort of like, is this some kind of weird like synchro mystic universal like trickster kind of thing playing out? Like, you know, it's like he was so involved in this Lincoln thing. And as we know, Lincoln was, you know, ended up with a hole in his head as well. And so like...
Boy, I hope that wasn't supposed to be a joke.
No, well, I mean, they both did, but, you know, like, I'm just saying it is interesting. You know, we talk a lot about tulpas and the idea that, you know, all this like thought and research. And I mean, this guy clearly was... like his whole mission was to make it to Jackson Hole and to stop at like every sort of Lincoln affiliated sort of location on the way there, like a little trail. And like, I don't know, it's just, it is weird that like they would both, you know, supposedly die in somewhat of a similar way, maybe.
Yeah.
You know?
Also, like, I you know, they only found a single set of footprints, right? And so like, they're not, that's what I'm saying. Like, either it's a highly skilled assassin that's coming after this, like, relatively nobody, really.
Yeah, right.
You know, one set of footprints. What am I supposed to believe? That someone else perfectly covered up theirs?
Yeah, that's...
You know? And then...
Well, no, I was going to say, like, also you know, we also got to remember that, like we said before, like, his sock would end up, you know, 6 miles away in a barn.
Well, and then like allegedly he was seen, I just looked at this, 150 miles away multiple times. And one of them being like not just a tavern and a bar. Hey man, this guy traveled, he walked 150 miles. He probably a little thirsty and needs a cold beer. But also like a Lincoln associated type place. And so that independent information about that is interesting to me. You know what I'm saying? Like, in other words, it's not like, oh, this guy's a known Lincoln historian. Oh, I think I saw him. You know, it's like, I don't know, man.
Yeah, it's so weird. And then also the idea that like, okay, was, you know, before all this went down, when he would show up at this, you know, Lincoln Museum or whatever with his sister there, you know, the lady was like, oh, basically, we've been expecting you. You're the guy that's writing and they both were sort of like dumbfounded, like, how did this lady know this? And then hand him a card, you know, from this sort of psychic medium, you know, on the back.
It's kind of like whenever I'm like, you know, in some random store and are you the, and they're like moving their glasses around. They're like, wow, you're the, and I'm like, well, thank you. Nice to see you. And they're like, you're the host of that #1 podcast.
Yeah, we are. International.
That Would Be Rad. Are, you know, internationally well-known, just #1 top of the charts podcast. That Would Be Rad. Is that you? And I say, yes, sorry. You know, and I take a couple selfies and then I go about my business. But you know, that kind of thing.
Yeah. No, but you know, I think, was that a supernatural thing, or was that somehow tied into this sort of big conspiracy that was playing out that had to do with possibly some, you know, people that maybe they were tied with the Freemasons, maybe it was like a totally other secret society type thing, and you know, maybe some of the men in his group. Like, there's just so many weird things, especially then I keep going back to this too, the idea that he would leave his briefcase at this one of the museums on his way out that would include his traveler's check. So back in the 80s, that would have covered your expenses and your, I mean, that's how you would pay for stuff.
Yeah.
It would have his glasses that he had to wear while driving. It would have like...
Just real quick, because I feel like if we have younger listeners, or if even our own kids are listening to this episode right now, you shouldn't have until maybe you're a little older because we talked about some gross dissecting and stuff. But traveler's checks, for those of you that remember, like you couldn't use like your own local check if you traveled out of state. They might, well, you could use it, but they might not accept it. So even as recent as my very first trip to New York City ever, I think this is maybe 2000, I don't know, man, 4, 5, 6, something like that. We had to get traveler's checks because sometimes hotels wouldn't accept an out-of-state check because they were so easy to kind of forge and that kind of thing, and the time that it would take for them to verify that check. And so you had to get these traveler's checks before you left, so that you'd actually have the ability to write out a check and pay for whatever it was that you did.
Yeah, this was before. I mean, maybe they had credit cards, but not.
They had credit cards, but they didn't have debit cards, really. I mean, when I went to New York, of course, they had a debit card, and my specific circumstances were a little different.
But I think even with that, like a lot of places would accept, your like bigger sort of chain places would probably take cards, but other small places, like they didn't have the old, card reader.
Yeah, it would say like cash or check only.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I don't know, man. I just...
Well, you said it best earlier, which is like, this is a situation that if you are the type of person that wants the resolution at the end and for there to be like this like big answer, this is certainly not the case for that.
No.
But like, I'm super interested to hear like what other theories people have. I mean, obviously, time travel is always my favorite one, not just because I get to play this sound.
Yeah.
But also, I'm just super fascinated by time travel and that kind of thing. What other theories are out there? I mean, was there some sort of dimension that opened and this guy walked into it?
Yeah.
And then there's other creatures that we don't even know about, and that's what they did to him. And then he came back and died. I mean, there's so much more to it, too. Like, I want more details about the actual autopsy and finding those records about, like, were they able to determine that the body, like, that it showed evidence of him not only being dead 4 years prior, but also any sort of deterioration of any sort of tissues or anything. I mean, it's just, there's so much to this thing that's just absolutely bizarre.
Yeah.
And I'm glad you didn't tell me about it until just now.
It really took a lot of...
Can we please, like, we got to, like, summer's almost here. Can we please start recording these things, like, earlier than late at night? Because I got to tell you, dude, I'm not like a scaredy cat, but I end up having, like, weird as heck dreams after these things. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And we got to start doing it a little earlier in the day.
Yeah. It's funny because, like, the only way that I can kind of explain the feeling that I get inside when I hear the Unsolved Mystery, synth, keyboard, little theme song. Like, when I hear that, it's not like an over-the-top scary. It's not like a, here's Michael Myers, here's Freddy, here's...
Right.
It's this weird, like, unknowing, like
It's worse, dude.
It's worse,
It's
and it
not
makes
a
it
jump
worse.
scare.
Right.
It's not like a cheap thrill. It's something that, like, is just deep within.
Yeah.
It's sort of like the same with, like, those two shows, man, when we were kids. Unsolved Mysteries and then Rescue 911.
Yeah.
They would just... They did a number.
Yeah. And then Robert Stack's voice over the theme.
Yeah.
I mean, it just...
I can't
made it so much worse. But the reason I say that is this story gives me that same kind of thing. Like, it's not an overbearing scary, but it's like there's so many things that are unanswered. There's so many things that it could be, but, well, no, it can't be that. Well, it could be this.
This way.
It's just...
If you're driving right now, listener, and you're in that part of Wyoming, or if I was, there's not a whole lot that I would stop for, if that makes sense.
Right.
I would just keep on driving.
Yeah, for sure. Well, folks, we're glad you stuck with us. We're sorry we could not provide any sort of explanation or sort of resolve to this crazy, case or disappearance, what have you. But we're glad you joined us. And if you want to talk to us, you can hit us on Instagram, shoot us a DM, jump in those comments. Tell us what you like, what you don't like about the show. We'll probably delete it if you say something you don't like, but either way, if you want to tell your own story, your own weird story, or you would like us to talk about a certain topic that we haven't covered yet, feel free to shoot whatever that may be to thatwouldberadpod@gmail.com. If it's your own personal thing and you do want to talk about it and let us put some badass music and sound design to it for a future episode, go on our website, thatwouldberadpodcast.com, and you can leave your voice memo directly to us. And if you agree, then we'd love to play it for a show in the future. Give us a 5-star review wherever you listen to your podcast. Tell a single friend about the show. And if you're not getting enough That Would Be Rad material here on the free feed, head on over to Patreon. We have our rabbit trail, and it's just more of what you love already. I guess that's about it. Again, I feel like everything just sort of fills up in the air. Feels like we didn't really figure anything out.
Doesn't feel up in the air to me. If I drive through Montana, I'm keeping it going.
All right. Well, we love you. We appreciate you. And as always,
be rad.
That's the way it goes. Time where I just needed some sunshine. You were already dead before you became a ghost. You always said our future would be a parade of flowers, but now all that's left is a single rose. That's the way it goes.
Granted.
What'd you think?
What a weird, so weird, this thing.
Yeah, dude, it is very weird, man. I am glad that I didn't tell you anything about
I'm
it.
all like
because-
jittery, dude. I thought I heard something. I mean, just man, golly. Oh, the best is that lady totally sounded exactly like this lady that ran this gas station that I worked at for, I think it might have been 4 days.
Uh-huh.
It was probably more like 2 days that I worked at this gas station, man. In college. It was like shady as heck, man. I just, I didn't want to do it.
Oh, I would imagine, my friend.
I mean, the first day I get there, the lady's like, all right, now keep in mind, dude, when you get into, and this is for the younger listeners, like when you get a new job, there's like a certain amount of time that is allotted to training the new employee so that they know the safety procedures, so they know, how to do that. The day I show up, okay, first off, you walk in, and this might have been one of the only places left in America where, hey, man, they still smoke inside. The ladies just literally smoking back-to-back. Chain smoking is what they call it, right? Just back-to-back, cigarettes. So I walk in, I'm just like, whew, gosh, that's a lot of smoke, but okay. And she's like, all right, let me show you something. I'm like, okay. She pulls out just a drawer. There's no lock on it. And it's got a key in there. And she's like, now, this is the key to the safe in the back. Every night, you just put all the money into this bag, and you put it in the safe in there. Don't worry about the combination. You just basically put it in there, close it, and then whoever opens the store tomorrow, they take it to the bank. I'm like, okay. Again, this is the key to the safe that apparently, like, if I open, I guess I'm going to have to use that, and then maybe I won't have to have it's confusing already.
Yeah.
Trust me. Then she kind of like closes again, and she's like, now, you see that mirror up there? And you remember those mirrors in convenience stores that are kind of like,
the round
it's like
ones.
a dome, round mirror, and behind it, usually there's a camera. And I was like, oh, yeah, I've seen this before. That's how you guys, security footage and stuff. She's like, yeah, we don't have any cameras, but that's just supposed to make it look like we do. And I'm like,
wow.
Okay, well, this is a pretty good little town that I'm going to college in. Maybe there shouldn't be any, like, weird stuff. And then she pulls out the same drawer, but she pulls it a little bit further.
Shotgun.
And there's, no, not a shotgun, man. A little, like
Beretta.
Revolver.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's in, like, a little, like, leather holster thing. And she's just like, now, this is just in case things get, wild. I'm like, oh, wow, okay. And she's like, I never have to deal with any of that kind of stuff. She sticks around for about 10 more minutes, and then she leaves.
Yeah.
She says, all right, now, have a good day. I'm like, what? Hello? And so, like, dude, they probably lost, who knows, man? People were trying to pull all kinds of things. Like, these truckers were coming and be like, where's Victoria?
Ooh.
I'm like, I don't know. And he's like, they usually got my coffee ready for me. And I'm like, oh, okay, well, the coffee pot's over there.
Anyhow, it is interesting, and it's funny because a lot of, we know this because of, hundreds of shows and driving all night and stuff. But like, it is interesting, when we would go from town to town, and you'd go into this gas station, there would be like a cast of characters that like they all knew each other. It's just interesting that there's this whole sort of nighttime culture that most people will never see,
Yeah.
It's super shady and super little.
Yeah, there's some nice people and stuff.
Oh,
but
yeah.
Boy, it gets a little wild. Like one guy like came and he's like, oh, well, usually she lets me just kind of put it on my tab. I'm like, sir, I don't really know, anything like that. And he's like, don't worry, they'll know. I'm like, all right. Anyway, man, I just never showed back up. After a couple days, just like,
that's amazing.
It was scary.